Hello, thanks for joining us on this episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. I'm Jonpaul Nevin.
And I'm Martin Jones, and in this episode we're talking all things endurance with Professor Andy Jones.
Critical speed is really important because if you exercise below it, you'll be able to attain a steady state in oxygen uptake, ventilation, heart rate, muscle pH. You go just slightly above your critical speed, and none of that is true anymore.
Andy was one of the scientists behind Nike's Breaking 2 project, which ultimately led to the world's first sub-2 hour marathon.
There were 3 athletes that we selected, one of whom was Eliud Kipchoge. If you watch him in Vienna when he runs the 1:59.40, he looks better in the last 100 metres than he did in the first. In terms of resilience in practice, I think that's the best example you could ever see.
We discussed the science behind endurance performance, how to use it to your advantage, and the emerging field of physiological resilience.
He had some individuals whose critical power in a fatigued state was barely different to what it was measured out in a fresh condition. And then he had others who deteriorated by 33%. The variability in that was what really astounded us.
Andy, welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. We've known each other for quite a few years, but for those people who've maybe never heard of you or don't know the research that you're doing, can you tell us about yourself? Where are you, what you're up to, and what's your route to where you are now?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of applied physiology at the University of Exeter. I've been at Exeter for 20 years or so, and all my life I've been interested in endurance, exercise performance, and particularly the physiological underpinnings to that. When we talk about endurance, you start to think about things like VO2, which I'm sure is something that your listeners will be kind of aware of. But I research everything and anything that has VO2 connected to it, I suppose. So VO2 max, efficiency and economy, maximal steady state, what's the highest speed that you can operate at and still maintain a stable VO2, VO2 kinetics, but also fatigue and training and the way that you can optimize human endurance performance. I like to do the fundamental research that allows me to answer some questions about what it is that limits performance during endurance exercise, what are the determinants of it, but also I like to work with athletes and coaches to generate the questions, but also to apply what I've learned to help them get better.
So endurance capacity has been identified in the literature consistently as being a key determinant of performance in many tactical populations, so military, police, fire service and so on. But for our listeners, could you sort of take them through the typical model which is used to explain endurance performance? So how do we conceptualise endurance?
Yeah, so I kind of introduced it a little bit by mentioning VO2 already, but really we've got 3 pillars of endurance exercise physiology, and a guy called Mike Joyner from the Mayo Clinic in the US back in the early 90s kind of conceptualized this model. It was focused mainly on the marathon, but he argued that if you know 3 things about an athlete, you'd be able to predict reasonably closely how fast they could run a marathon. So the first of those 3 pillars is the VO2 max. By VO2, we just mean the amount of oxygen you can get from the air, transport through your blood. Your heart pumps it around your body, it gets to your muscles, and the mitochondria in your muscles extracts the oxygen and use it to generate energy. Obviously, there's different ways by which we can generate energy, aerobic and anaerobic. But when we're talking about endurance, the vast majority of the energy is aerobic. Okay, so that's why VO2 is so important. What's the maximum rate at which we can use oxygen from the air? And then secondly, how efficiently we can use that as well. So if you have, say, 10 people all running along at the same speed, you'd expect the energy cost to be the same. And then theoretically, you'd expect the VO2, the oxygen cost, to be the same as well. But in fact, it varies quite considerably from one person to another. So while different people have different VO2 max values, they also have different efficiency or economy. So there's those 2 things. And then the third part of the Joyner model is the fractional utilization of the VO2 max. But that starts to get you towards things like lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, and so on. So, there's a certain speed that you go out and run and you feel actually quite comfortable, like you could go on for a fair while. And you only have to go incrementally above that speed. And all of a sudden you think, I'm not going to be able to sustain this for very long. So when we're talking about threshold or critical speed, it's that knife edge between those 2 domains of exercise intensity. The idea is that if you know a person's VO2 max and you know the fraction of the VO2 max that they can sustain comfortably, so you multiply those 2 things together, that gives you an oxygen demand, if you like, and you divide it by the running economy, and actually you can then predict the speed that they ought to be able to sustain for a given distance or a given duration. In fairness, that model has stood us in pretty good stead for quite a long period of time, but they tend to slightly overestimate what an athlete can do, unless they have an absolute flyer. when I was working with Nike on the Break Into Marathon project, we tested, I think, 17 of the world's best runners. We used the joiner model, amongst other things, to help us select the 3 that went forward. Thinking has moved on a little bit since then. There's this, what I've been calling the 4th dimension, which is physiological resilience.
I was at Exeter when you were measuring those athletes. I remember it all being very hushed up, and it was like something big was happening, and you kind of walk around a corner and there's a little guy, you think, well, I recognise him. And then a few months later you find out, oh yeah, that's why that world leading athlete was on campus at that time. Let's dive into this resilience thing then, Andy. Tell us about this 4th dimension of endurance performance that you mentioned there. What is physiological resilience?
I think the problem with the joiner model, and I don't want to criticise it too much because, as I've said, it actually does work pretty well in most cases, but the assumption that it makes is that your start line values of those 3 variables, your VO2 max, your economy, and your threshold, essentially, are fixed. They're static and they don't change. But of course, we know that isn't true. So if you were to run a marathon, and I've measured you a few days before the marathon started, so I know what your baseline fitness is, and I may have predicted what you might be capable of for a marathon on a good day. But if I pulled you out of the marathon at 25 miles and measured all of those things again, it'd be pretty surprising if your VO2 max was the same as it was in a fresh condition. I mean, for a start, you'll have sweated a bit. The sweat basically comes from your plasma, so you lose plasma volume. That means that it's harder for you to deliver as much oxygen to your muscles, and that's one of the key things that influences VO2 max. But we also know that your economy will change. You only have to look at the way people run in the first couple of miles of a marathon to the last couple of miles to understand that their biomechanics have changed. They've fatigued, and it's costing them more oxygen to transport their body mass over a given distance in the latter stages compared to the early stages of a marathon. So their running economy has deteriorated quite considerably. The other thing that can happen when you're running for long periods is you start to change the substrate that you use. So, your muscles like to use a combination of carbohydrate and fat. The faster you go, the more carbohydrate you use. Now, if you're an elite marathon runner, you want to be using as much carbohydrate as possible because it's actually a really efficient fuel. You can synthesize more ATP for a given amount of oxygen when you're using carbohydrate compared to fat. But when you start a run, you generally use more carbohydrate, and the longer you go, first of all, your glycogen levels in your muscles start to fall, so the availability of carbohydrate goes down, but also you start to mobilize fats. And so the relative proportion of fat to carbohydrate changes, and that costs you more oxygen as well. And then thirdly, the other thing that can happen is you can get muscle damage. Your muscles start to get sore. The muscle fibers that you recruited in the early miles, your type 1 or slow twitch fibers, they start to get fatigued. They're not generating power to quite the same extent. And you have to recruit additional muscle fibers, which eventually will start to become type 2 or fast twitch fibers to enable you to continue to run at that same speed. But those higher order fibers that you've recruited later are also less efficient as well. So you've got all of this stuff happening simultaneously, which means that you become less efficient with time. And thirdly, your threshold will change as well. You'll find it harder to sustain the same fraction of your VO2 max as you go through a race. It just feels harder as you go along. So essentially what this resilience piece is recognizing that those 3 variables are dynamic rather than static. Now, what's quite cool about some of the work that we did that ran alongside the Break Into Marathon projects is that we were measuring critical power in a fresh condition. Then on another day, we get people in and ask them to cycle for 2 hours, reasonably hard, and then immediately measure critical power again. Now, on average, the critical power is about 10% less across the group. But the variability in that was what really astounded us. So you had some individuals whose critical power in a fatigued state, even though they'd done 2 hours of heavy exercise, was barely different to what was measured out in a fresh condition. And then you had others who deteriorated by 33%. So just this huge variability. So we start to consider that as an independent determinant of endurance performance because the extent to which their critical power deteriorated wasn't correlated with anything else at the baseline. So you need a high VO2 max, you need good economy, you need a good threshold when you start, but you also have to be sufficiently fatigue resistant or resilient to try to maintain those at the start line value as long as you can. And some people do that extremely well and others don't. And we're still trying to work out what it is that distinguishes the one group from the other.
Andy, how does this play out in multi-day events? What if somebody is doing a marathon a day, maybe not necessarily running a marathon, but equivalent? I'm thinking these people that do the ultra marathons across the Arctic where it's 50k then they have a rest period, and then they do it again. Do you see this same sort of model of endurance performance? Does it play out across multiple days? Are you able to sort of buy a bit back with good rest and recovery and good feeding?
I think both of those, probably, Martin. I think this probably will play out during multiple days of endurance exercise. Of course, nobody's really studied it because it's hard to do that, isn't it? I do think that you can bounce back a bit, and I think that those individuals who partake in ultramarathons or multi-day endurance events, it does appear that they're the ones that can bounce back a bit better. It depends how you define resilience. It's really the extent to which you resist fatigue, and that could be acutely within a single event, or it could be more chronically over many days. I think when it comes to ultra endurance, some of the physiological variables are still important. It's probably still the same ones, just the big three, plus the resilience. But for sure, there's bigger psychological contribution once you get into that kind of territory, and also a big nutritional component. You know, are you able to replenish the calories that you lose, and are you able to sleep well and recover and go again? So it's a slightly different scenario, but nevertheless, I think there are parallels. It's such a growth sport, isn't it? It seems like marathon's not enough for a lot of people anymore, and we don't know enough about it yet, about physiological or other determinants. In the same way that we don't do enough for 800-meter runners, because it gets more complicated because there's a big anaerobic element. So getting a handle on those other bits becomes a little bit more complex.
So Andy, just expanding on that further, from a psychological standpoint, are there models that could be integrated within this fourth dimension?
When I write about this, I do tend to make that distinction because I think clearly it's psychophysiological. So you're never going to get your best performance if you're not sufficiently motivated or pain tolerant, or all the things that you guys know about better than I do. But nevertheless, I think there's a physiological resilience as well. So it isn't just about the psychology. And actually, when it comes to the elite athlete, I'm prepared to make the assumption that psychologically they're pretty similar. They wouldn't be as good as they are if they didn't have what it takes psychologically. But nevertheless, you still find that one is better than another. And actually, with the Break Into Marathon project, there were 3 athletes that we selected, one of whom was Eliud Kipchoge, who of course went on to break the 2-hour marathon barrier. And when you measured all of the variables, Kipchoge was obviously immensely good, but there wasn't a great deal to distinguish him from the other 2. But it was only Kipchoge that did it. And if you watch him in Vienna when he runs the 1:59:40, he literally looks as fresh as a daisy. He looks better in the last 100 meters than he did in the first. So in terms of resilience in practice, I think that's the best example you could ever see. I think there's a fourth physiological dimension about Kipchoge's physiology that allows him to be the outstanding marathon runner over the last close to 10 years.
Can we dive into that, Andy? You've said this fatigue resistance, this physiological resilience, like what is it? Maybe in the absence of any hard data, I mean, what's your gut feeling? Is it something that is genetic? Is it measurable? Is it something that you could train? Like, why is Kipchoge so good ultimately?
And it's the $1 million question, isn't it? Yeah, I don't think we absolutely know for sure yet. I think you touched on a few of the possibilities already. One is there's a genetic component to all of these things, including VO2 max, and it's probably the same for resilience as well. And it's hard to think that there's something that's different to what we might already consider to be necessary for good endurance performance anyway. So you'd want lots of type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers, which are fatigue resistant. They've got lots of mitochondria. They're really well oxygenated, lots of capillaries around the fibers and so on. So all of that's going to give you a high threshold and a high max. Whether you need even more to make you more resilient, I don't know. What I would say is that if you measure East Africans in a fresh condition compared to the best Caucasian athletes, there's not a lot to differentiate them. But they're small and they're light, lighter than you would usually see in the UK. And they've got really quite thin legs, but long Achilles tendons. And I suspect that while if you measure them just in a 5-minute test in the lab, there's no difference in their efficiency. When you get beyond 20 miles and everybody else's economy is deteriorated because their biomechanics has gone wrong, these guys still have a really good what we call stretch shortening cycle. So their economy in the latter stages has probably been better preserved. How you train it, I've just published an article speculating, because this is such a new concept. There are 3 questions, actually. What are the mechanistic bases for these differences in fatigue resistance between people? Nobody really knows. You can make some suppositions, as we've just tried. How do you measure it? And then thirdly, if you've got somebody whose resilience could be better, what do you prescribe? How do you make them more resilient? So those are 3 huge questions in the realm of endurance science generally, I think, that lots of people are starting to pay attention to. In terms of the training, again, if you look at what Kipchoge's done, I think Paula Radcliffe was another example of a very resilient athlete who was on the scene for a long time. Kipchoge and Radcliffe both won their marathons with negative splits often, which means they're getting faster as the race goes on rather than slower, which would be more characteristic. The things that they have in common is that they started as track runners. They started on the track 1,500 meters, moved through 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, eventually took to the road. They've just been at it for 10 or 15 years. So I don't think there's necessarily a quick fix to develop resilience. If you can avoid injury and train really consistently and regularly, most days, most weeks, most months, for many, many years consecutively, that's probably going to make you pretty resilient. The other thing that Kipchoge does, and East Africans do generally, they practice very specific sessions to what they're going to encounter in the race itself. So they'll quite often run 25 miles in training at altitude on terrible, dusty trails up and down hills in full tracksuits, often without adequate nutritional preparation. And they'll cover those 25 miles, and this is like 2,400 meters of altitude in about 2 hours 15. And they'll start slowly, start really slowly. And actually, one journalist go out to Kenya to watch them. They come back with this suggestion that the Kenyans just train slowly all the time. But all they've done is they've watched them jog off at 6 in the morning when they're all stiff and they're barely out of bed. Within a few miles, they're rattling along. And they do these progressive runs over 25 miles where they get faster and faster and faster. And by the end of it, you've got Kipchoge or someone like Jeffrey Kamora just hammering out the miles sub-5s. So I think that gives you very specific preparation. There's a bit of suggestion at the moment that resistance training, plyometrics and heavy strength training could be beneficial as well, which we might get into, but the Kenyans don't do that. And it would be a brave man indeed to say to Kipchoge, we want you to not do 120 miles a week, just do 80 and do a couple of weight sessions instead.
I'm guessing you're not the man that's ever suggested that to him then, Andy.
No.
I remember dropping that suggestion in jest to Mark Cavendish, and it went down like a lead balloon. I geared my giving advice to professional athletes after that. Andy, just curious, so you mentioned utilisation of the stretch shortening cycle. Have you guys done anything in the lab looking at an individual's ability to utilise the stretch shortening cycle, quantifying it, but then looking at it post an ultra endurance event? Are they still able to maintain that utilisation, or is there a change?
I know there's been a study where they did things like jump tests at different stages over a fatiguing bout, and actually there's something in that the people that lose their elasticity, for want of a better phrase, are more fatigable. So there may be something that we can do within that, to do drop jumps or some kind of plyometric test. So there's something about the innate characteristics of the muscle that seems to be influenced.
Do you think it might revolve around the structure of the tendon as well, and that MTJ and that interface? Could there potentially be a genetic component there in regards to the collagen matrix itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and maybe the strength and plyometric training that I mentioned might be something, if you haven't got it genetically, that rather than making your muscles stronger, it's about actually ensuring that the neuromuscular junction, the tendon compliance and all of that can be more appropriate for the task at hand.
Yeah. On that, for our listeners, I just want to caveat the use of plyometric training. Please don't go onto YouTube and type Russian plyometric training, because you might see some extreme examples of people trying to jump off a 10-metre balcony and it not quite working too well for them. So that is not plyometric training.
Yeah, good to know. I won't do that. Andy, when I'm working with people in occupational settings where they require endurance performance, like maybe military personnel who are marching for a long, long time, day after day after day, have you got any thoughts around what we can do to improve things like VO2 max or lactate threshold? I'm guessing you put a load on someone's back and their biomechanics goes pretty strange. Their endurance capacity is going to be affected by their economy and efficiency whilst under load. But what are the tips and tricks from your years of experience of training endurance that we can offer people to help build up these core components?
Well, when it comes to VO2 max, it's actually quite hard to say a specific session does this and this different specific session does that, because there's a lot of overlap. So, for example, if you've got someone who's reasonably sedentary at the moment and you just got them out jogging 20 minutes 3 times a week, their VO2 max would go up a bit, their economy would go up a bit. So there's like this general level of fitness as well. If you're of a reasonable standard already, then improving VO2 max is really about improving your ability to deliver oxygen at the highest rate possible to your muscles. And I'm a firm believer in specificity. So if you want to improve your VO2 max, you probably need to be training at an intensity that's close to your VO2 max once or twice a week. You can't do it every day because it'd get a bit much. And you can exercise at your VO2 max for probably 6 to 8 minutes if you did it in one continuous swoop. But again, that's not necessarily to be recommended. And what you're better off doing is splitting up that 6 or 8 minutes into intervals. And that means you can do more volume at VO2 max intensity. So the idea is to get your heart rate up to within 5 to 10 beats of its maximum, or hit its maximum by the end of a rep. So you might do something like 10 or 12 times 1 minute intervals with about a minute recovery. That's one example. The classic for distance runners is 1,000-meter reps. And they might do 4 or 5 1,000-meter reps. Takes around, say, 3 minutes or so, and a minute or two's recovery in between. But the intensity is high. The idea is that you stress your ability to maximally take in oxygen and deliver it. So you kind of giving your cardiac output a good workout, essentially. Then when it comes to efficiency or economy, what we find in the lab is that people are most efficient at the speed that they most frequently train at. So if you want to get really efficient at going at a particular speed, then you should train at that particular speed, as well as various others. And again, mimic the conditions. So walking at a particular speed or running at a particular speed is all very well if you're unloaded. But if you're talking about a situation now where you've got a big old heavy backpack on, you probably need to be practicing walking or running at those speeds with the backpack on to just get that specificity again. Then when it comes to the threshold bit, if your threshold is at a certain speed, there are 2 ways that you can go about improving it. I think you do a fair bit of volume just below it. So you build up your aerobic capacity, your oxidative capacity, more mitochondria, gives you a really good high quality aerobic training stimulus. And the idea is that pushes your threshold to a higher intensity. But also you should do bits of exercise just above it as well, what we call tempo or threshold type training. So you're putting your body under that stress, which you won't particularly appreciate. So you're above the threshold, breathing's a bit harder, lactate is accumulating. And over time, what you'll do is your body will put in train mechanisms to help you better able to deal with that if you should have the misfortune to come across that scenario again. And so by training above it, the idea is that you probably get better at clearing the lactate. So you've got this bulk of your training is below it, which is pushing your threshold to a higher intensity, and you've got a bit above it, which is pulling it in that direction as well. So it's those 3 things: high intensity interval training for your VO2 max, training your efficiency by doing a variety of different speeds, but without neglecting the conditions under which you actually intend to perform. And then threshold is good volume of work just below it and a little bit just above it, just to kind of balance things.
Andy, just going to expand upon that point a bit further. So within the military for a long time, the physical training was endurance, squadded runs. It was very much regression to the mean. It wasn't individualised. There was endurance circuits. And people poo-pooed that because they seen it as, it increases the likelihood of injury and it doesn't prepare people for the demands of the battlefield. And around 2013, a paper came out stating it, the battlefield's anaerobic in nature. However, that statement caused a number of issues. One, it didn't take a bigger picture of the actual physiological determinants or demands of that role. And also then people jumped on it because it was, fun enough, it was the same time that HIIT was gaining popularity. And people were then like, oh, we can do 15 minutes high intensity interval training, it'll be more time efficient, it'll give us the same bang for our buck. And that started getting pushed out massively. And what we've found is over that 10-year period, the aerobic capacity or the endurance performance capabilities of military personnel particularly have lowered. And I think we're seeing that now very clearly in the evidence, and there's sort of a pendulum shift back. But then it boils down to, we know what the problem was, but how can we potentially address that problem? So I'd love to get your take on the concept of training intensity distribution for the warfighter population particularly. Obviously, they need a big engine, and there's periods where they need to be able to accelerate, go to ground and do whatever it is. So from a training intensity distribution viewpoint, what would you think would be the best approach for them to adopt?
Yeah, so I think with the HIIT thing, it kind of does give you a fair bit of bang for your buck. So it has its role. You can get quite important muscle metabolic adaptations. It's in that domain where you're going to be improving your VO2 max. That's unquestionable. But it's not new in the sense that we've known that interval training works, and it's a good way to accumulate more volume at a high intensity than you'd be able to if you did it in just one continuous effort. Okay, so I think that forms a part of a balanced training program, but it's probably not going to improve your endurance capacity or your resilience. So you would imagine that if it's a true test of endurance, if you've not practiced that or done anything in training to particularly equip you for that thing, that then HIIT alone is probably not going to cut it, so it plays a role, but you can't neglect all of the other stuff. My view on training intensity distribution is that I think polarized has got way too much credit or went unchallenged for so long. And I mentioned that specificity, I think, is really key. Of all the sort of training elements, one of the key ones I think within it is specificity. And polarized, for me, neglects that. Again, if you're an endurance runner, you will tend to be in that middle bit, what we call the heavy domain. So you've got this moderate domain below your first lactate threshold, you've got the heavy domain between the two thresholds, and then you've got the severe domain where you're above that second threshold and you can't get any homeostasis. And polarized would advocate that you do a ton of work down in this low intensity zone, and then you do a bit of high sprint interval training at the top and you don't do anything in the middle. To me, that seems like madness. I know less about the way cyclists and swimmers and cross-country skiers and all of that do things, but runners definitely train in a more pyramidal fashion. So for sure, they do a good volume of work below that first lactate threshold. There's still a certain speed that should feel comfortable, even if it's easy. You don't need to be doing 12-minute miling if you feel easy at running 8-minute miling. And then the second most highest proportion stuff is in that middle zone, where they're doing like steady and starting to get towards some tempo. So they're doing continuous running mainly, but it's with a bit of a purpose. And then a smaller fraction, maybe 10%, is going to be in that severe domain where they're mainly doing interval type efforts. I think basically in a balanced program, you want to be covering as many bases as you can. And it doesn't make sense to me to neglect any of it. But obviously what you have to do is analyze what are the demands, what are you actually trying to prepare for. So if you've got a particular intensity and duration bang in the middle, you try and do stuff all the way around it, really, I would suggest.
That makes perfect sense. Can we loop back to the critical power that you were talking about earlier, that 33% loss and some people hardly lost anything?
Yeah.
Was there anything noticeable? For example, if I'm a 33% kind of person, I've got very low physiological resilience and I fatigue a lot. How do I know? Unless I come into the lab and get tested by you, is there a way of knowing that my capacity to continue is being degraded, apart from just slowing down, I guess? I mean, like, how do we know?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some sort of degree of perception of it. If you think you're similar in fitness to somebody else and you can run with them for 5K and you can run with them for 10K, but actually you try a half marathon and they're fine and you're not, probably gives you a bit of a clue. There have been some sort of field-based studies done on this, and there's something called uncoupling, and that's the relationship between heart rate and speed. So there was this study done of like 83,000 marathon runners or something like that, where people were able to report what their speed was over the course of a marathon, but also report the time course of their heart rate. And then you've got this ratio between heart rate and speed. I mean, heart rate's not quite the same as VO2 because there's going to be environmental and hydration impacts on that as well. But let's imagine for a minute that heart rate is kind of a correlate of VO2. So you've got heart rate and speed. If you've got good coupling, then over the course of the marathon, that doesn't really change very much. But in other people, either for the same heart rate, their speed starts to fall away, so they're not very resilient, they've succumbed to fatigue, or they're able to maintain the same speed at least for a while, but they're doing it at an increased physiological cost and the heart rate's going up. So they've got this decoupling between heart rate and speed. So that's something that could be looked at, and the extent to which that deteriorates when you go through longer efforts in training. That might tell you something. I've got this lad that I'm working with in Devon at the moment called Jake Smith. He's a really good, promising marathon runner. And from the regular treadmill testing that I can do, I can kind of predict what he ought to be able to sustain for the marathon in terms of speed. He's not run a full marathon for a while, but he's been pacing like elite athletes in major marathons. And at least up to about 18 miles in these races, he's had no uncoupling. I mean, of course, the wheels could still come off after 17 miles, but at least up to that point, not only does he have good lab data on the joiner pillars, the big three, but at least from what I can see in the field, he seems to be pretty resilient as well, which again gives me confidence that should see more from him in due course.
Is that something that if I'm out for a run and I'm constantly looking at my Garmin and looking at my heart rate, I've got a chest strap on, all that kind of stuff, and I notice that I'm slowing right down and my heart rate is going up and up and up, do I stop? Is that a signal to say, hang on a minute, right, you've got to a point now where you're not going to get any training benefits, so just stop Or is it a case of now that is the time when I have to grizz it? That's when I'm going to get the most psychological benefit. What do I do with that?
Yeah, well, I think eventually you will have to stop if that starts to happen too much.
It happens early for me on most runs, Andy, to be honest.
But I think actually digging in a little bit in that is probably exactly what you probably need to expose yourself to if you want to get better. I think going to the point where your physiology starts to deteriorate, like your biomechanics starts to become altered, and psychologically as well it gets tough. And that's exactly what you're trying to prepare yourself for, isn't it? And again, that's that specificity thing. You almost need to go slightly over the edge in order to force the adaptations, but also to get familiar, to get accustomed to that type of fatigue and how you're going to deal with it. All of those things are important, I reckon.
So essentially stress inoculation training.
Yeah.
Tying it all together.
You love stress inoculation training, JP. We've done about 10 episodes this series and you've not mentioned it yet. So yeah, there's the first one.
The thing is that you probably shouldn't do that every time that you run either, because actually then you'd be in a situation where you're probably going to be overtrained or end up injured. So you've got to do that in small doses, I think.
Andy, from an applied perspective, could you give us more of an insight into the concept of critical speed or critical power or critical power? What is it and how can we potentially utilise it as a threshold to demarcate training intensities?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Yeah, so let's talk about critical speed. So there's a couple of ways by which it can be measured. So what you could do is go to a track or go to something where you've got a measured distance. You might run, say, 800 meters. So all I need to know is that you've covered exactly 800 meters and the time it took you to cover the 800 meters. That's on day one. You might have an easier day on day two. Day three, you come back and you run a mile or 1,500 meters. How fast can you cover that? And then maybe 3,000 meters a couple of days later. With those three, I mean, ideally, the more you've got, the better, but you can do it pretty well with three if you're given a maximal effort each time. Basically, what you kind of construct is a speed-time relationship. Okay. The other thing I could do is put you on a treadmill at a given speed and see how long you can sustain that speed for until you have to stop. And again, we do that on 3 occasions, 3 different speeds. Ideally, I want a duration that is at least 2 minutes, but no more than maybe 15, with another one somewhere in the middle. And if you can do it 4 times and go somewhere like 2, 5, 9, and 15, and then you've got this evenly spaced within that area. And essentially, it's literally the speed-time relationship. If you plot the speed on the y-axis against 1 over time on the x-axis, you end up with a straight line. You've got this y equals mx plus c, which people might remember from their GCSE maths or whatever. But the intercept of that linear relationship is your critical speed, and the slope of the line is something called the d prime. And the d prime actually is interesting as well, because that tells you something about the anaerobic capacity. But the critical speed is really important, because if you exercise below it, it'll feel reasonably comfortable. You'll be able to attain a steady state in oxygen uptake, ventilation, heart rate, although that can drift over time if you get a bit hot or dehydrated. But within the muscle pH is stable, muscle phosphocreatine is stable, inorganic phosphate, which is a really key mediator of fatigue, that's stable. Your blood lactate level is stable as well. You go just slightly above your critical speed, and none of that is true anymore. Even though the speed's the same and it's ostensibly submaximal, your VO2 will rise with time. It's called this slow component, until eventually you hit your VO2 max. Your blood lactate will be climbing inexorably over time, and all of those things that I mentioned within the muscle cell will be changing at a dramatic rate as well. Your phosphocreatine will be falling, your inorganic phosphate will be shooting up, and all of those things collectively mean that you fatigue much more rapidly. And in fact, the causes of fatigue are different when you're below compared to being above that critical speed. So I think it's really an interesting and really useful thing to have, and you can measure it in the field, as we've just said, with a measured distance and a stopwatch, or you can go on a treadmill and you can calculate this really, really easily. Obviously, different individuals have different critical speeds. Your best athletes have the higher values, but actually that critical speed and D prime collectively tell you something about the physiological attributes of every individual as well. And as you might imagine, a middle distance runner might have a slightly lower critical speed than a 10,000 meter runner, but they'd have a higher D prime, meaning that they're actually better able to access anaerobically produced energy, which is what you'd want when you're running at super maximal intensities over 800 or 1,500 meters.
I'm prepared for this to be a pretty stupid question, so just bear with me while I ask this one, Andy. So obviously I'm not a physiologist. If I've got to walk over a mountain at 4 kilometers per hour speed, does the same critical speed idea apply if it's going over various terrain with a load on the back? Do I need to figure out my critical speed and then do certain amounts of training to bring that critical speed up? Or are we talking about a concept that really only applies to running?
No, it should still work. That relationship, that speed time relationship, but it can be power time as well. So this works for running, for cycling, for swimming, for rowing, for uphill walking, and it works across the animal species as well. With greyhounds and mice and horses and crabs, all sorts of things. There's like a fundamental property of muscle energetics. So it's pretty cool like that. I mean, essentially, it's still a metabolic rate that's reflected as a speed. And it's a bit like your VO2 max. The two should kind of go up in parallel. The critical speed is just a bit more functional. The higher your critical speed is, the lower any metabolic demand will feel. You see what I mean? So let's say walking at 4 kilometers per hour up a mountain requires a certain VO2. For that to be achievable for you, manageable and sustainable, that VO2 needs to be below the VO2 at your critical speed. So the higher your critical speed is, even if you're training for something like walking over a mountain, having a high critical speed when you're running is going to put you in better stead, such that the metabolic energetic cost of that task, this case walking up a mountain, is lower than you're physically capable of. That said, going back to the specificity principle again, you probably also want to be doing lots of practice of lugging bags up and down mountains.
Without too much, because you'll injure yourself.
Exactly.
Andy, in a lot of the organisations, they have standardised fitness batteries, and one of the most common ones is a mile and a half run, or in fact it's changed now, say 2.4k, it's 2k, just to make it a bit more convenient. Could we use 2k run time as a surrogate measure of critical speed, and then maybe do like a 100 metre sprint to get maximum sprint speed, and then sort of quantify anaerobic speed reserve and use that as, it's not perfect, but it might be useful for a large group?
Yeah, it's going in the right direction. I think 2K is probably slightly on the low side. That's probably going to give you a maximal aerobic speed sort of a thing. It's probably going to be higher than the actual critical speed, which you'd get if you did those three or four separate time trial sort of a thing. Because what critical speed does is it separates one domain from another. It separates a steady state domain from a non-steady state domain. And in a way, there's no such thing as running at your critical speed, because it's literally a knife edge. You know, on a bike, you can measure critical speed to a single watt. I might say your critical speed is 268 watts. But there's obviously a little bit of error in the extent, I can't measure it to that degree of precision. There's a bit of an error in my ability to measure it. And every day you're going to be slightly different. Your physiology will be slightly different. And so if I exercise you at 268 watts, it might be that on one day you're slightly below your critical power and can go for quite a long time. On another day, you're slightly above it, and it's exhausting. You can only do 10 minutes. But typically, critical speed is around that 25 to 30 minutes. So if you exercise at an intensity that causes you to hit your VO2 max, or you're above your critical speed, then that's likely to be an intensity that takes less than 25 minutes for you to become exhausted. If I exercise you for 35 minutes, the chances are that even though you become exhausted at the end of 35 minutes, it's going to be below your critical speed, because you won't hit your VO2 max at the end. You'd be fatigued for other reasons, like you'd run out of glycogen or something like that.
Andy, can we go back to the Breaking 2 project? I know that's something that you were heavily involved in. And so I remember it at the time at the university, seeing you in all your night kit every day. I knew something was going on.
Yeah, one of those freebies.
Can you tell us how you got into that project, and what was your role and what did you find?
Well, what had happened was that the world record back in about 2015 was about 2:02:57. So it was starting to get within the realms of, could this actually be possible? We mentioned Mike Joyner at the beginning. He'd done a model suggesting that sub-2-hour marathon could be possible, but the person concerned would need to have a VO2 max of X, an economy of Y, and a threshold of Z. And they all seemed to be a bit outlandish at that time. And the world record, when he wrote his paper in the early 1990s, was way off 1:59 at that stage. But once you get into the 2:02s, you can start to revisit that and go, so maybe now we're starting to get athletes that might be of an appropriate caliber, and there are probably scientific advancements that we could now consider that could expedite this. I mean, some people didn't think it was possible. I was less of a skeptic and more of a believer, and I thought that it was going to happen one day, and actually there were probably things that we could do to fast track that as well. So I'd started to talk about this in conferences, saying, you know, these are the characteristics of the athlete. these are the conditions that we'd like to have environmentally. This is the sort of track that you would want. These are the sorts of benefits that you could get from things like drafting and pacing and training and nutrition, all of that stuff. And I think on one of those occasions, there must have been a Nike representative in the room who probably thought to themselves, actually, we already sponsor most of the top athletes. We've got all the connections. We could put the show on the road. We could put all of those pieces together. If it's going to happen, why not do it in Nike's name, and we can get some kind of commercial and reputational advantage from it? One afternoon, I got a phone call from Nike saying, we're going to actually give this a go, and we'd like you to be the external consultant on it. It was great. I mean, I used to run myself, and then I've always researched the limitations and determinants of endurance exercise performance. I was working with a lot of the best runners in the UK. I think the fact that I'd worked with Paula Radcliffe for 15 years, Nike were thinking, not only does this guy know the science, but he knows how to apply it as well. And we're going to have to be able to pick the right people and develop those same people to be in their best condition on the day that we choose to take on this challenge. So, yeah, so that's how it came about. And of course, I was made up to be involved in something like that. So we got them in the lab. A lot of them came to Exeter. Some of them were tested over in Nike's base over in Portland, Oregon. So we went over there and did that. Chose the 3 athletes from the 17 that we tested. And then it was just like a load of brainstorming. It's like, when should we do it? Where should we do it? How do we best prepare the athletes? What's the optimal nutrition strategy? How do we draft them effectively? And all of that. So it was like full on for about 18 months. And then on the first occasion, Kipchoge ran 2:00:25. So it took 2.5 minutes off the world record, but was 1 second per mile away from 1:59:59. But it was awesome because there was still a load of skeptics who thought this is just a publicity stunt. I mean, on that day, Kipchoge wasn't quite as resilient as we might have liked because he was on for it until about 2 miles to go and then just faded off. But I think that was the big breakthrough, that event, because it was inevitable that he or somebody else was going to do it shortly thereafter. And sure enough, 18 months later was the Ineos 159 challenge in Vienna. And then, of course, he had his second chance and ran the 159:40. So that was the story, yeah.
Impressive. Now, Andy, you say you run a bit. What's your PB for the half marathon, Andy?
Well, it's a very old PB now, but when I was 17, I ran 66:55, which was a British record. I think it's still a UK record, actually, because I was 17 and a half and ran 66.
Yeah, pretty rapid. Now, if we look back, I mean, that's a while ago, I'm guessing. Don't want to offend you there, Andy, but it's a few years.
1987, yeah. That's all.
Technology has changed a lot in endurance. Obviously, controversy around the shoes, mainly, yeah. I guess. If you were holding up a crystal ball and you're looking at maybe the future of marathon running, how fast is someone going to go? And what tech do you think is going to enable that to happen?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the shoe because, of course, that was another element to the Breaking 2 project. Nike had been developing the secret shoe for a while. They're extremely lightweight. They're beautifully cushioned. You just don't get as damaged. So 2 things have happened with the shoe. We know that if you put the shoe on, you're immediately at least 4% more economical. But that's just over the first 10 minutes. I suspect that where the shoe really comes into its own is in the last few miles, not the first few miles. You may still get a little bit of damage and you might lose a little bit of efficiency, but it will be to a much lesser extent. But the other thing that's happened is the top athletes are training in these shoes as well as racing in them. And what they're finding is that they do the 25 miler in the Alpha Fly, and the next day they could do it again if they needed to. So the total volume of training that they can do and the quality and intensity of what they do is higher. So they get into the start line in better condition, and then they get in the acute advantage of wearing the shoe in the race as well. I think a sub-2-hour marathon in a major big city race is not far away. But there's somebody who's just run a 56-minute half marathon. Just unbelievable. If you can run a 56-minute half, as long as you're resilient enough, you should be able to run a sub-2-hour marathon. So it's going to happen.
In terms of your research and the science, what's the next step for endurance science? Is there anything on the horizon?
Well, I think it's absolutely this resilience thing. Everybody's jumping on that because I think we've known about VO2 max and threshold for a long time. We know how to measure them. We think we know what the mechanistic basis is. We think we know how to train them, although some of that isn't crystal clear. But resilience, everybody's jumping on that now as the new kid on the block. There are 2 things that you can do acutely that can improve your resilience. One is nutrition. If you can use more carbohydrate and less fat, there's a lower oxygen cost. So the loss of economy that you would otherwise see can be mitigated if you can take on board a lot of carbohydrate. So you maintain your muscle glycogen stores keep your blood glucose high, keep using lots of carbs in your muscle. So things like the Morton gel, where people are now able to consume 120 grams per hour of carbohydrate. I think being able to use fat as a fuel is really useful, so you don't tap into your glycogen. But on the other hand, in the event itself, making sure you've got access to carbs, especially if the intensity is a bit on the higher side, is going to be valuable.
Awesome. I know you've got a book coming out fairly soon, if you've ever finished writing it.
Doing a bit this morning, actually.
Yeah, good. I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. We like to wrap the podcast up by just offering it over to you to give us the final words. So this is usually something that maybe you've not introduced yet, or maybe to reiterate something that's particularly important. So how would you like to close up today?
I think probably returning to that thing I said about consistency. So it isn't just about training really, really hard all of the time. I think you have to be committed. If you can train most days, most weeks, most months, you're going to do better in the longer term. One of the things I learned from spending time with Kipchoge and his comrades up in Kenya is that they know when to switch off as well. They don't train really, really hard every day, and they enjoy it and they have fun, and that means that they just keep coming back for more.
Great stuff. Andy, that was a great way to finish. Thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed today. That was awesome.
Cheers, bro. Thank you.
Thank you both.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.